You can support In the Past Lane by buying some of our merchandise. We've got merch with quotations from famous people in history, like Abraham Lincoln, fellow citizens, we cannot escape history, and Confucius, who said, "Study the past if you would control the future." And we've got some snarky ones too, like one of our bestsellers that says, "Dear America, okay, I'm begging you, stop repeating this shit." Signed, History. You can get these designs and many more on everything from a t-shirt or a hoodie to a coffee mug or a beach towel. Just go to our website, inthepastlane.com, and click on merchandise. Thanks.
We the people of the United States, in order to form a more
to huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
And the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Hi there. Welcome to In the Past Lane, a podcast about American history and why it matters. Brought to you by SBI, Snoring Beagle International, and coming to you from the Eugene Debs Studios, located in central Massachusetts. I'm your host, historian at large, Edward T. O'Donnell, and this is episode 193. Every week here at In the Past Lane, I tell you what happened in U.S. history this week, with special attention to one important story. So, what's happening in the Past Lane this week? Well, I'm busy wrapping up the spring semester. Definitely the strangest one of my career. I think that's true of pretty much any teacher or professor. Overall, I'm thrilled with the way my students responded to the challenge of online learning, which made my job so much easier and really enjoyable. Now all I need to do is grade final papers and file the grades. In the meantime, my garden is looking good, and my cooking skills continue to advance. If I haven't mentioned this before, I highly recommend the recipes found at New York Times Cooking. They are designed to be easy, based on readily available ingredients, and completed in under an hour. See my Instagram for the evidence. I'm at In the Past Lane. Also, many thanks to some of our new patrons of the podcast, including Donald, Tammy, and Joshua. Thanks for the amazing and generous support. It all goes to paying for the costs of producing this podcast, and I really appreciate it. All right, let's get on with it. Here's what happened this week in American history. Let's start with this. On May 11th, 1894, employees of the Pullman Palace Car Company, located just outside of Chicago, went on strike. The walkout was in response to severe wage cuts that came as the nation descended into the worst economic depression in its history. But what started out as a local strike soon blossomed into a nationwide work stoppage that paralyzed the railroad system and caused a national crisis. The Pullman Strike, one of the most famous in U.S. history, marked a sharp turn in the fortunes and reputation of the Pullman Company's owner. For well over a decade, George Pullman had enjoyed a reputation as a benevolent industrialist. He established the Pullman Car Company back in 1867 to manufacture luxury railroad cars. Pullman was an idealist who believed that workers and employers could work together in harmony for mutual benefit. Acting on this idea, he established the town of Pullman in 1880. It was a company town, built and owned by the Pullman Corporation for its employees, who rented homes and patronized stores owned by the company. Residents also had to abide by many intrusive regulations imposed by the company on their personal activities. George Pullman earned widespread praise in the media for being both a model capitalist who earned a vast fortune, but also provided decent wages and living conditions for his workers. So long as the Pullman Company remained profitable, its employees considered themselves relatively fortunate. But then a devastating economic depression struck in 1893. Known as the Panic of 1893, it wiped out thousands of businesses and sent the unemployment rate over 20%. The railroad industry was especially hard hit. So, George Pullman laid off hundreds of workers, and to those still employed, he announced a wage cut of 30%. On top of this devastating news, workers learned that Pullman had refused to reduce their rents, which were deducted automatically from their paychecks. Some workers soon began receiving paychecks for less than $1 per week to cover the cost of food, heat, and clothing. And so it was that on May 11, 1894, the fed-up and furious workers at Pullman voted to strike. George Pullman responded, as did most employers in that era, by refusing to negotiate with the workers. But after 6 weeks, a man named Eugene Debs, the leader of the American Railway Union, or ARU, announced that all of the union's 125,000 members from across the country, as an act of solidarity with the striking Pullman workers, would impose a boycott on the Pullman Company. They would refuse to handle any Pullman cars. Given the ubiquity of the Pullman cars, the ARU's boycott soon slowed the nation's railroad system to a crawl. In response, the heads of more than 24 railroads joined forces to support George Pullman and break the ARU by hiring thousands of strikebreakers and pressuring the governor of Illinois to send in the state militia. When the governor refused, out of sympathy for the strikers and a desire to avoid violence, the railroad magnates turned to Washington, D.C. for help, asking President Grover Cleveland to send in federal troops. Cleveland was not the first president to face the choice of whether to send federal troops to quell a labor dispute. President Andrew Jackson dispatched troops in 1834 to end a strike by disgruntled workers working on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. More recently, President Rutherford B. Hayes had sent troops to crush the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Despite these precedents, however, Cleveland worried about the ideological and political ramifications of military intervention. For one, the use of the army against American citizens seemed to run counter to key Republican principles. Had not the Founding Fathers established the United States to escape an oppressive British government? Had they not also adopted a Bill of Rights that sharply limited the use of federal power? Cleveland also had to consider the possibility that the public would condemn such use of federal power, especially if violence ensued, as it did in 1877. So the president spent several agonizing days in late June and early July of 1894 consulting with advisors and mulling over his options. Despite harboring some misgivings about using federal troops to resolve a domestic dispute, President Grover Cleveland was a pro-business conservative, and his administration reflected this outlook. He authorized his Attorney General, Richard Olney, a man with extensive ties to the railroad industry, to obtain on July 2, 1894, a court injunction declaring the ARU boycott of the Pullman cars a, quote, conspiracy in restraint of trade, unquote, that interfered with the movement of the U.S. mail. This last part about the mail was key. Because delivery of the mail was a federal responsibility, the Cleveland administration claimed it had an obligation to the public to stop the boycott. When Debs and the ARU members defied the injunction, Cleveland ordered the U.S. Army to intervene on behalf of the railroads, to end the boycott and get the trains moving again. The arrival of federal troops touched off extensive violence. Workers clashed with soldiers and destroyed railroad property, and soldiers responded with rifle fire that left at least 37 dead and scores wounded. Federal officials arrested Debs and several other ARU leaders, and the boycott collapsed in mid-July. The Pullman strike lasted only a few more weeks before ending in early August in complete defeat for the workers. By then, public opinion had turned against George Pullman for his obstinate refusal to negotiate with his workers. As was the case 2 years earlier in the Homestead strike involving Andrew Carnegie and his steel workers, the Pullman strike exposed the notion of a benevolent capitalist as a myth. Both Pullman and Carnegie were arguably better employers than many of their capitalist counterparts, but their benevolence ran a distant second behind their primary concern, profit. When profits were threatened by unions or economic downturns, the benevolence was replaced by ruthlessness. In the aftermath, President Cleveland tried to restore his reputation with American workers by making Labor Day, a holiday established in the early 1880s, a federal holiday. He also established a commission to investigate the cause of the strike. Its final report criticized George Pullman for his handling of the strike, and it argued that labor unions and government regulation were necessary as a way to curb the unrestrained power of corporations. But 1 year later, a very conservative and pro-business Supreme Court declared that the use of court injunctions to end strikes was constitutional. It would be another 40 years before legislation passed during the New Deal established legal protections for workers and labor unions. There was one positive outcome of the strike for American workers. It launched the storied career of Eugene Debs, who became an iconic labor leader and advocate of socialism for the next 30 years. Debs would run for president 5 times as the nominee of the Socialist Party of America, and he left a lasting influence on American society. So what else of note happened this week in U.S. history? May 11th, 1934, a massive dust storm begins to sweep across the Great Plains. Drought and high-level winds carried off from the so-called Dust Bowl some 350 million tons of topsoil, causing tens of thousands of poor farmers known as Okies to migrate to the West Coast. May 13th, 1846, after a questionable border incident between U.S. and Mexican military forces, the U.S. declared war on Mexico. The subsequent U.S. victory allowed it to seize the northern half of Mexico, land that became the future states of California, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Nevada, Utah, Texas, and Colorado. May 15th, 1970, 50 years ago this week, city and state police opened fire on a crowd of African American students at Jackson State University in Mississippi, killing 2 and injuring 12. This incident received a fraction of the attention given the killing of 4 white students at Kent State University 11 days earlier. And May 17th, 1954, the Supreme Court of the United States issued its Brown v. Board of Education decision that declared segregation in public schools to be unconstitutional. And if you want to learn more about that decision and how it played out over the next 20 years, check out In the Past Lane episode 40. And what notable people were born this week in U.S. history? Well, 2 legends of the silver screen were born this week. May 12th, 1907, Katharine Hepburn, and May 16th, 1905, Henry Fonda. May 13th, 1914, heavyweight boxing champion Joe Louis. And May 17th, 1903, baseball legend and Hall of Famer James Thomas Cool Papa Bell. Okay, time for the last word. Let's give it to an anonymous Pullman employee who said the following about the problem of living in a town completely controlled by one company. We are born in a Pullman house, fed from the Pullman shops, taught in the Pullman school, catechized in the Pullman church, and when we die, we shall go to the Pullman hell. Well, that's going to do it for In the Past Lane this week. You can learn more about me and everything we talked about at inthepastlane.com. And let's interact via social media. I'm at In the Past Lane on both Twitter and Instagram, and our Facebook page is In the Past Lane Podcast. See you next week.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.